Hi everyone, and welcome to the first JavaTalk of the 2018-2019 school year. My name is Patrick Allegra, and I'm here to start us off and explain why we're doing the changes to language instruction in terms of our teaching of it. What led to this, what's the context, and how are we going about it? So let's get started. And I'm going to try and do it fairly quickly so that it doesn't take much more than 10 minutes of our time. 25 versus 34. What does this number represent? Well, 25% of our students would score in the 90th percentile of the test known as the National Spanish Exam. And to be honest, they were actually in the 97th, 98th, 99th percentile. So basically the top end of the test, and that's a national test given to that teachers elect to have their students take across the whole country. We took this test for about 5 years when I first came here back in 2009. The 34, however, represent the percentage of students who were scoring below the 50th percentile. And I was seeing this trend continue year over year, in some cases student after student. One of the big reasons for the discrepancy was this 3 versus 1. In other words, language instruction at most schools, Holy Innocents is not unique in this, has multiple entry points. Therefore, students on the same grade have different amounts of time that they've studied a given language. And so what would happen is that a lot of the kids scoring well in the National Spanish Exam were kids who took language, in this case Spanish, for 3 years in the middle school, so taking it as a freshman or a sophomore, right, their scores were generally better than, say, the sophomore who's only had Spanish 1 as a freshman who's only had Spanish 1 as a freshman in their first year at Holy Innocents. So it's sort of this unlevel playing field. And what can we do to sort of adjust and adapt so that everyone gets roughly to the same point when all is said and done? Lastly, we also would see in our enrollment, certainly for upper level courses, huge drops. 70% Latin, half the kids in French, and about a third of the kids in Spanish. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of which we can control and some we can't. The obvious one is that you only need to take 3 years for a graduation requirement. So for many people, once you had your 3rd year after junior year, senior year, you went and took something else. So we left. Here's what the situation was when I became chair. We had a sizable chunk of students below the national median. Not sizable is my interpretation of it. We have large attrition rates once they reach the graduation requirement. We also have kids who've taken language anywhere from 3 to 10 years, right? And then, of course, as always, we're charging somewhere around $30,000 a year. So it gets me thinking about, from the department, what can we do? What can we do to help students acquire language and increase their proficiency? In other words, what can I do to help those 34% of kids who are continually scoring below the 50th percentile? Because for $30,000 a year, we need to do something. What can I do to increase upper level language enrollment? How can we convince students and families that it's in their best interest and worthwhile for them to take that additional year, to use up one of their electives for a language course? And tied into these things are the other questions. What can I do to ensure that the assessments that we give people are actually valid? I shouldn't have a kid scoring in the 20th percentile on a standardized test but getting an 88 in the class. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And then, of course, what can I do to control the message about the purpose of language education? Because, quite honestly, not everybody sees the value of it. We're in America, we speak English, and English is spoken all over the world. So what's the point? So I came up with basically a couple of hypotheses. I think that students and families will want to take a language when they feel like they're learning something practical, they can see and feel their growth, right? And then we understand that the purpose is not to be perfect nor to be error-free. And lastly, we have to have a tangible end product so that we can stop having people say, yeah, I took Spanish all through high school, and I can't say a word of it. We need to do better than that. So, this, of course, these hypotheses, improving them, there's lots of challenges in the way. And here's just a couple of them in terms of what we need to do to convince and educate teachers, how we have to train teachers as well as students, right, so that your language class is sort of taught and assessed in a way that's different than the other classes that you take at school, And then, of course, educating families about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then what that's going to look like, which, of course, one of the things that I'm looking to do is having this JavaTalk with you right now. Here's just a quick timeline of what we've sort of started doing, right? And I actually started with assessment first. We started looking at and talking about assessment as what is it? Are we assessing what we think we assess? How valid? All those kinds of things. That's where it started, because I believe assessment is what informs your teaching. It's not the other way around. Let me come up, I'm going to teach a bunch of stuff, and then a week later, I'm going to say, all right, what did I teach? And let me create a test about it. That's incorrect, in my opinion. And then here we are now with this in 2018, which is what we're working on now to sort of establish a thing for the whole department. Right? Obviously, these are happening. If you have me as a teacher, this is definitely happening. And then depending on what teachers you have in the French or in the Spanish classes, they're sort of somewhere along this continuum of sort of starting to turn this way in terms of the way they assess and the way they teach. And then, of course, in the future, what we're looking to do eventually, I want to say, this is how we do it as a department. This is how we teach. This is how we assess. This is what it looks like. And then it's clear and everybody's on board with it. All right, so what are these beliefs that I'm talking about? What do we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? And of course, I've got the Marshall McLuhan hand. It's almost become cliche nowadays, but the medium is the message, right? If the students can say and do things in the language that they're studying, then everybody's going to be happy, and this becomes a moot point. The left-hand side of things are things that we have, we're working on, we're revising, etc. And eventually, these will be published documents that are sort of like a statement of purpose for what we do. The things on the right-hand column are more tied to the things that need to be done, and sort of are tied to the global program as well, and things that we're working on to sort of help sort of connect the language classes with the global studies program, of which we're sort of clumped together. We have STEAM, we have humanities, and then there's global, which is the global studies program, the entrepreneurship angle, and then the language angle. So one of the first things we did was a mission statement. What's the point of the department? Well, it's to develop students confident and proficient skills in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Those are the 4 key skills that we need to do in a language other than English, within a rigorous and relevant environment. Those 2 R's are important. Rigorous doesn't mean run people through the gauntlet, right? But it also doesn't mean we're just going to, watch movies all day and that's it, right? Program goals, an integrated proficiency-oriented program, which I'll explain the difference of that in just a few moments. But here are tangible end products that we're looking for. And one of them, of course, is I want to have 80% of our students will have achieved a proficiency rating, right, of advanced low, as articulated by the American Council of the Teachers of Foreign Language. That's what ACTFL stands for. After 10 or more years of study in the same language. If your child's been taking French since 1st grade, by the time they graduate high school, we should be able to put something on their transcript that says this child is intermediate, or advanced low in French proficiency, right? Because that has meaning, and people understand what that means, right? Much better than an A or a B can articulate. 70% for intermediate high, advanced low after 7 years, and then 60% of the students intermediate high after 3 years. These are ambitious goals, right? There's not a lot of data out there I can say, well, at school here, this is the percentage they got. These are things that we're shooting for. Even Michigan State University is one of the colleges. There's several, but one of the ones I know well because I know that I'm friendly with the director of the language program at Michigan State University, and these were their goals. And they didn't really achieve them in a college setting. I can say for us, for the 60% intermediate high after 3 years, we were on track to get that. Of course, it still means there's 40% of the kids who didn't get that, but that's, but if they're intermediate mid, that's okay. I don't want them being novice low after 3 years. That's a problem. We're not seeing that happen currently. Those are the courses, but Latin doesn't have a communicative requirement. Therefore, the stuff that I'm talking about today doesn't really apply to the Latin classes. It could, but we've elected to not do that. Assessment, right? Ongoing, right? But notice this is the key piece, aimed at ensuring that students' scores are both valid and accurate reflections of their knowledge and ability to use the language. Oftentimes in school, everything about assessment is just on the knowledge, but not using it. And for our classes, that's the key component. It's like 30% do you know, 70% can you use? And that informs a lot of the things that we do. Core presumptions, assessment and pedagogy is the fancy word for and teaching are two sides of the same coin. Formative assessment predominates. That's what I meant when I said earlier about, I have the assessment first, and that is when the results of those assessments inform what I'm going to do the next day, because that helps me identify where there's areas of misunderstanding or weakness. And then that's what we focus on, rather than I've planned my thing out for 2 weeks and I'm following come hell or high water. I'm not interested in that. Measuring student growth over time is the goal. If you were back to school night, you heard me say it's unrealistic to expect your child to have an A all through the year, because learning doesn't happen like that. If that were the case, they need to move. They're in the wrong class. They need to move up. And of course, we're going to use proficiency scales. Other things that we talk about, and I'm over my 10 minutes, so I'm going to end it quickly. What the role of zeros, retakes, the difference between accuracy versus comprehension. It's a big deal that we sort of were discussing and talking about. And pluses and minuses, B plus or A minus, which, by the way, in my opinion, are bad things. They give the illusion of greater accuracy, but actually they don't. And I'll be talking about the assessment piece in the next JavaTalk. Of course, comprehensible input is our preferred method of instruction, right? And so in order for them, we have to make it relevant. It has to cover information that's important to the students, right? And we also have to create it so that we can learn, or so that we can use the language in class. And then, of course, there's lots here on the theory, which you can follow up and read if you want to certainly ask questions of, but I don't want to take up too much more of our time. But please know that SLA stands for Second Language Acquisition, right? And 40 years of this research tells us a lot about what we know, how human beings acquire language, right? And I sort of just focus on number 8 quickly, which says, the ability to understand language in meaningful context exceeds the ability to understand decontextualized language, or to produce language of comparable complexity. In other words, studying verb forms, studying vocabulary lists is not helpful in acquiring language, right? I can talk to you in a comprehensible way, and you will understand everything that I say. But then if I turn around and say, all right, now you say it, it's almost impossible for you to do. And that's because there's a hierarchy of your brain's ability to understand language versus produce language, okay? And that comes out then in the way that we organize our grading scale and what the proficiency scale also has to do with. Right? We're also focusing on proficiency, which is fluency, and the reason for that is this, which I'll end it with. When we talk about fluency, which, by the way, there's no agreement on what that actually means, but when we talk about fluency, that's what most people say, well, I think they're fluent. What they're really talking about is people are proficient. What we do in class is performance. I tell the kids what they need to do. We practice, 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 and then we do it. That's performance. Proficiency is the next stage of that, where I don't tell you. I just come in and start asking you questions or telling you to write something down or giving you a prompt, and then you have to produce without any practice time. In other words, you have to rely on the practicing you did the day before, the week before, the month before, and see how well you can do it in the moment. Okay? Fluency also implies a sort of a greater sort of pop cultural understanding, which is very difficult to do. I am heavily proficient in Spanish, but my fluency in Spanish, it's sort of like I'm stuck in the late 80s, early 90s, because that's when I lived there, right? I haven't paid attention to the to the details of the current events in Spain since 1994. So I don't, you follow what I mean? So I wouldn't be able to converse on that topic right away. I'd have to sit, listen to people, do some reading, and then I could come on into it. All of this, of course, is just a long-winded way of talking about what we have in terms of time. Second language acquisition theory tells us input is the key thing. In school, we have anywhere between 300 and 900 hours, and where you need like 9,000 in sort of an immersion thing. You get 9,000 hours of input in school in English, and you get 900 hours in Spanish, right? If you started in 6th grade, we'd get roughly 1,200 hours of hearing Spanish. Whereas if you were a native speaker starting from 0 to 6th grade, you'd have almost 15,000 hours of input. In other words, it's impossible for us in a classroom setting to get kids to super high proficiency or fluency, right? Because we need the input. Now, the point is then, what's the point? If we can't do it, well, I reorganize the chunks of the grammar. That's how we do it. So there's some hacks we can do to help expedite the acquisition, right? And so we have our agreement on the hierarchy of importance, and these are basically the things that whether we do in 3 to 10 years, if you can do these things, this will give you the level of proficiency necessary, right, with practice to sort of sound like you know what you're talking about and can do things. Okay, that brings us to the end. I apologize for going a little bit over, I think I went about 5 minutes over. But hopefully, hopefully this was informative. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me. And just a reminder that the next JavaTalk, which will talk more in detail about the assessment piece, is on Tuesday, October 16th. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.